Hi, I am Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where we learn about him through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today by my co host, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, are you ready to dive back into these collected letters of C.S. Lewis compiled by our good friend Walter Hooper?
Absolutely, Jeff. I'm all set to explore more of Lewis's world through his letters. Let's see what insights he has for us today.
All right, let's jump back into it. This is a letter to his brother. It is written, postmarked July 1st, 1921. Well, I don't know if it's postmarked, but that's how it's dated. He wrote it from 28 Warnford Road in Oxford, where Lewis is a student. I think he's over halfway through his studies there, but he's still continuing to, I don't know if I'm using this word right, but to matriculate at Oxford. And he hasn't heard from his brother in a while. His brother is over in Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. Um, he's a military man, and so that's where he's stationed right now. And Lewis has sent several letters and hadn't heard anything back for a while. And so finally, he's writing another letter to his brother because apparently he has heard from him at this point.
Got it. It sounds like this letter marks a moment of reconnection between Lewis and his brother after a long silence. It's fascinating to think about how this exchange sheds light on their relationship, especially with Warnie being so far away in Sierra Leone. Lewis must have been relieved to finally hear back. Shall we dive into the contents of the letter?
Let's do it. You ready?
All right. Picking up from where Lewis begins to unpack his thoughts and daily life, I'll follow your lead as we explore the details. How would you like to proceed? Straight through or pausing for reflections as we go?
I'll go straight through and I'll call on you when I'm ready. All right, here's the beginning of the letter. He says, My dear W, I was delighted to get your letter this morning. For some reason, it had been sent first to a non existent address in Liverpool. I had deliberately written nothing to you since those two that you mention. Not that I was tired of the job, but because I did not feel disposed to go on posting into the void until I had some assurance that my effusions would reach you. He says that seemed a process too much like prayer for my taste. As I once said to Leo Baker, my mystical friend with the crowded poetry that I mentioned a while back, I said to him, the trouble about God is that he is like a person who never acknowledges one's letters. And so, in time, one comes to the conclusion either that he does not exist or that you have got the address wrong. I admitted that it was of great moment, but what was the use of going on dispatching fervent messages, say to Edinburgh, if they all came back through the dead letter office? Nay, more, if you couldn't even find Edinburgh on the map. Leo's cryptic reply was that it would be almost worth going to Edinburgh to find out.
This section really captures Lewis's sharp wit and his frustration with unanswered communication, whether with his brother or in the broader sense of prayer. His analogy to sending letters into the void, especially tying it to the feeling of unanswered prayers, is both poignant and clever. It seems like he's blending humor and existential questioning here. Do you want me to unpack any specific part of this?
Not yet. Let me finish how he closes out this thought. He says, I am glad, however, that you have ceased to occupy such a divine position, and will do my best to continue, though I hope it won't be for 15 months. So yeah, it is interesting that he would compare this experience to that of prayer. And you can go several different directions with this, but just one of the thoughts that occurred to me is, when you're writing letters to another person and you're used to receiving letters back, whenever that stops, you do start to question, hey, what's going on? It's not working the way that it worked before. There are several different directions you could go when you're doing an analogy to that with prayer.
Exactly. It's a very human experience. When the flow of communication stops, it feels unsettling. Like you're in a one-sided conversation, and it's easy to question if the relationship is still there. With prayer, too, The sense of not receiving a response can make one feel disconnected or doubtful about whether the communication is even reaching its intended recipient. Lewis, in his usual way, turns this feeling into something insightful and witty, likening it to the experience of writing letters to God. It's an interesting perspective, showing how he balances humor with deep reflection.
All right, thanks, Robot Lady. I see here in the chat, from whom all blessings flow, wishing us, or wishing me, sorry, not you, Robot Lady, a Merry Christmas. I think that's Sam, if I remember my avatars correctly, my YouTube avatars that come in here into the chat. So thank you. Merry Christmas to you too. We are one day away. It is Christmas Eve in the year of our Lord 2024. Robot Lady, I did want to talk about this a little bit more. So what I was saying is, if you just do like a compare and contrast, one of the things, that you would expect to get back whenever you're corresponding with another human, someone of like being, is the same type of letters that you're sending off, right? The same form of communication. Now, when you send up prayers, you're sending up prayers to a wholly different type being, God and man. If you follow the Christian tradition, yes, they merge together in Jesus of Nazareth. But whenever I'm offering prayers, first of all, that's a different medium than a written letter or an email. If you were to advance it to today's current technology, or actually old technology by today's standards, even a text message, I would expect a response in like kind back from the same type of being. But then whenever I'm offering up prayers to God, the type of communication that I get back could come to me in like many different forms. I guess it just depends on what I expect or what things I'm looking to perceive as far as answers or, unanswered prayer and what that looks like. So sometimes I guess the argument could be made that if I'm not attuned appropriately, it may appear as if God is not responding, or perhaps it's a time thing. Maybe God responds, but the response doesn't come until, decades, perhaps, years later, maybe even years after I've passed. I don't even get to see the response, which is kind of strange. So anyway, just some random thoughts there on the analogy that he's making. I don't think he was using it for any type of philosophical depth. I think he was just using it for humor's sake.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Lewis seems to be using the analogy to highlight the frustration and uncertainty that can come with communication, whether it's with a human or with God. It's funny, but also profound in how he captures that feeling of sending something out and not knowing if it's being received. In the case of God, the medium of communication and the response can be so much more nuanced, which adds another layer to the experience. You're right that it's less about philosophical depth here and more about the humor of a situation that a lot of people can relate to.
Yes, I agree, Robot Lady. Thanks. I'll continue with the letter. Actually, before I do, let me check this chat right here. Have you ever written a letter without knowing if there would be a response? Yeah, I mean, sometimes whenever I was sending out letters as a kid to I will say celebrities. I never really did anything like that. I sent some work of mine whenever I was like 12 or 13 years old off to Marvel Comics, hoping to get a response back from them, and never heard anything. So I was expecting a response, but I didn't know if I would get one. And indeed, to this day, I have not yet received it. So I'm still waiting on my response, Marvel Comics.
Ah, yes, that feeling of anticipation, especially when you're sending something off with high hopes but little certainty. It can be a little disappointing not getting that response, like when you're reaching out to someone you admire and wondering if they'll ever take the time to reply. It sounds like that experience with Marvel Comics was one of those moments where the waiting game felt long and the response never came. Maybe someday they'll surprise you with a letter. But it's funny how even when we don't know what to expect, we still take the risk of putting ourselves out there, whether it's for creative work, as a kid, or something more significant.
It reminds me of my single life as well, where I would send a text message hoping to get a response, but not knowing if I would. And several times I did not get a response. But thankfully, I'm married now, and she has responded several times over. So that's good.
That's great to hear, Jeff. It's always nice when those unanswered messages turn into meaningful connections. Now that you're married, it must feel like a whole different level of communication.
Yeah, all right, let's get back to the letter. We're learning about C.S. Lewis, not me. He continues. Here, another term has blossomed and faded. That time moves has, I believe, been observed before. I have lived my usual life, a few lectures, until, as happens about halfway through the term, I got tired of them. I got tired of them all. Meetings with friends, walks and rides, solitary or otherwise, and meetings of the Martlets. Martlets is the literary society that Lewis, I believe, is the secretary of. These birds, by the by, were all invited to dinner by the Don Martlets a few weeks ago, and I again had the opportunity of peeping into the real Oxford, this time through the medium of a very excellent meal, with wine, as Milton says, with the air of a footnote, in cool, brown, oaky rooms. I have been thinking of a formula for it all, and decided on Glenmachan turned male and intellectualized. That's fairly good. Glenmachan, of course, is the home or the house. That's what they call the house that his cousins, the Ewart family, live in back in Belfast. Robot Lady, do you have anything to say?
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
It's all good. I'm going to keep going. The great event of my term was, of course, optimism. This is the essay that Lewis wrote that we touched on in the last episode that he submitted for the Chancellor's Prize and won. So he says the great event of my term, of course, was optimism. I must thank you for your congratulations before going on. They were provoked by the event, but the consequences of it will move your ribaldry. Prizemen, the statutes say, quote, will read at the incania portions of their exercises. I like that word. Their exercises, chosen by the professor of poetry and the public orator. Sounds damn fine, doesn't it? But the statutes omit to mention the very cream of the whole situation, and that is, namely, that the prizemen will appear in full evening dress. Fancy me entering the Sheldonian at 11:30 a.m. on a fine June morning in cap, gown, boiled shirt, pumps, white tie, and tails. Of course, it was a broiling day, as the potato bird would say, and of course, for mere decency, I had to wear an overcoat. So the potato bird is a reference to C.S. Lewis and his brother's father. They make fun of his Irish accent, the way that he says potato. And anyway, so he's recounting a little bit of that event that Lewis attended, where he read a bit of his optimism essay to several dignitaries. So Robot Lady, any thoughts on that before I continue? If so, try to keep them to, let's say, 25 words or less.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now.
All right.
Could not understand what you said.
He says, however, I managed to make myself audible, I am told, and beyond
Go for it.
However, I managed to make myself audible, I am told, and beyond
It looks like you're in the middle of reading a part of the letter. Can you share more of it or clarify what you're looking to discuss?
Robot Lady's lagging a little bit, so I'm going to put earmuffs on so I can finish reading this part, and then I'll come back and ask her some questions if I have any. He continues, however, I managed to make myself audible, I am told, and beyond nearly falling as I entered the rostrum, I escaped with success. They do actually call it a rostrum, so that I was delighted, for the whole gallery of Damerfesk seemed to gaze at me, and the jarring ghosts of Lord Big, Polonius, and Arubutta to lend me countenance. So what he's doing here is he's reflecting back on his and his brother's imaginary world that they created called Boxen. And you can find several episodes back if you look at the channel where I covered Boxen. But he's just having fun here, talking about how he's reminiscing about some of these governance events that they had concocted. And so these are some of the characters. If you go back, that's who he's talking about here. And there's a footnote to help us a couple of different places. So he mentions something called the Damerfesk. And in Surprised by Joy, it says here in the footnote, that's Lewis's autobiography that he writes much later in life. He says, Damerfesk is described as the common legislative assembly of Boxen. Unlike that of England, it was not doomed to one fixed meeting place, but could meet anywhere that the joint sovereigns chose. So that's what the Damerfesk is. It's kind of like Congress or just some type of legislative body. House of Lords, I suppose, is what it is in England. And then Lord Big is the first character that he mentions, imagining gazing at him as he's up there giving his speech, who was a frog and was actually kind of a cutout for their dad, Lord Big. If you go back and read through those, you can have some fun there. Polonius Green is a parrot. He kind of drove all of he was kind of the conflict or the antagonist that drove a lot of the drama in one of the early stories, one of the first stories from Boxen. And then Sir Charles Arabuda, a fish. Now, I don't remember him as a significant or prominent character in the Boxen stories that we read. Daniel's not here right now in the chat, but Daniel was there, as we read through all of these. So maybe he'll remember if he watches this. So these are all characters from the world of Boxen, which C.S. Lewis and his brother Warney created as boys. So he's just talking about, how that was going through his imagination. He says, this was really the fault of one not unlike our Arabuda, old Kerr, the professor of poetry, who, having earlier in the proceeding delivered his Latin oration, decided to remain sitting in the rostrum instead of going back to his own stall. This, in the language of Marie Stopes, quote, made entry difficult, if not impossible, end quote, for us prizemen. In my anxiety to avoid the burly professor, I stumbled over a raised step and nearly fell backwards. So who is Marie Stopes, you might ask, as he's recounting this little comedic interlude? It says here that Marie Stopes, who lived from 1880 to 1958, was an early sex reformer who devoted herself to birth control. So now you can see the silliness in this little quote that he added. He says, this in the language of Marie Stopes, quote, made entry difficult, if not impossible, for us prizemen. So this guy was blocking their walkway. He stumbled over a raised step, nearly fell backwards. This must have appeared curiously enough to those who were on a level with or higher than the rostrum. But the best effect of all was from the floor, from which, owing to the height of the front barrier and the big velvet cushion on it, I appeared simply to sink through a trap and rise again like a jack-in-the-box. However, I rallied my sang-froid and bawled defiant remarks on the universe for 2 minutes. So it's funny. He's already recounted this experience of going there and speaking to his father in a letter in the last episode, but he didn't share any of this silliness with his father, only with his brother here. And so then he goes on to mention his father. It is a good thing that the potato bird was not present, or he would have been sorely put to it, especially if you had been beside him, giddy with laughter. So if you were sitting there giggling at my foibles, he says, Dad would not have been pleased. And excuse me. And then he says, you can imagine his asking me afterwards, did you do that to annoy me? So did you trip to annoy me? I will send you a copy of my essay since you asked for it, though I do not think it will be much in your line. We learned in the last episode that this essay that he won a prize with at Ensom Notoriety at Oxford, or at least an opportunity to get in front of some very high status people, has not survived history. So we don't have a copy of it, or at least a known copy. But he tells us a little bit about it right here. He says, I think it will be much in your line. Some of the insolent passages may amuse you. I hope you will like the way I dealt with the difficulty of, quote, God or no God. To admit that person's existence would have upset my whole apple cart, but to deny it seemed inadvisable, on the off chance of there being a Christian among the examiners. So this is an interesting point that he makes right here. To admit that person's existence would have upset my whole apple cart. To deny it seemed inadvisable. So yeah, it's interesting. I would like to see this essay now, even though I'm not going to get to. But he tells us, he says, I therefore adopted the more Kirkian alternative of proving. So Kirkian, he's talking about here, is W.T. Kirkpatrick, his and his brother's tutor, that helped him get into Oxford and helped his brother get into, I believe, the Sandhurst Military Academy. Kirk was an atheist, didn't believe that there was any life after death, kind of just believed you disappear from existence after you die. So he says, I adopted the Kirkian alternative of proving, at any rate to my own satisfaction, that it really made no difference whatsoever whether there was such a person or not. The second part of my essay you may use as a mild test whether you are ever likely to come to metaphysics or not. So that's an interesting take of if, and I presume that his essay is about the value or lack thereof of optimism. If you try to take the approach that it doesn't matter if there's a God or not, maybe he takes a utilitarian approach of just saying, hey, whether or not there's a God doesn't matter. It's not important. You can test this out. If you're optimistic about life and each day when you wake up, perhaps things will go better for you than if you are pessimistic. I'm thinking that maybe that's the argument that he makes, but again, I don't know. He says, the second part of my essay you may use as a mild test whether you are ever likely to come to metaphysics or not. I look forward with some trepidation to discussing it at home, for his, quote, reading of the thing will doubtless differ vastly from my writing of it. So that's interesting. Clemenceau took an honorary degree at this same ceremony, and though an imposing figure, suffered by contrast to the other two Frenchmen presented with him. So Clemenceau, as we learned from an earlier letter, is George Clemenceau. He was Prime Minister and Minister for War of France from 1917 to 1920. He was there in person. One of the other dignitaries was Sir Roger Keyes, who was there, an admiral of the fleet from 1920 to 1929. And there was also the Canon of Notre Dame, Paris. He was the Monseigneur, I don't know how to say that, Pierre Battefolle, a distinguished church historian. So those were the dignitaries who got to listen to C.S. Lewis give his first, as far as I'm aware of, his first public speech. So very interesting. He says, Clemenceau took an honorary degree at this same ceremony, and though an imposing figure, suffered by the contrast to the other two Frenchmen presented with him. There's no doubt that a butty, B-U-T-T-Y, though a genius, remains a butty still. I don't know what a butty is, but before I get into that, I see Sandy in the chat. Hey, Sandy, thank you. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas Eve. It's almost upon us once again. Robot Lady. I'm going to ask Robot Lady a question. I had to put earmuffs on Robot Lady because we were bumper cars with just like talking over each other and interrupting. So let me take the mute off and ask a question. Robot Lady, I want to read you these couple of sentences and get your help with this word here. He says, Clemenceau took an honorary degree at this same ceremony. This is where Lewis gave a speech for accepting the Chancellor's Prize, or read part of his essay that won the Chancellor's Prize. He says, Clemenceau suffered by contrast to the other two Frenchmen presented with him. He said, there's no doubt that a butty, B-U-T-T-Y, though a genius, remains a butty still. What is this word butty, B-U-T-T-Y, that he's using here, Robot Lady, in this context?
The the word buddy in this context is a bit unusual. In British slang, buddy can sometimes refer to a sandwich, especially one filled with simple ingredients, or in some cases, it's used as a term of endearment like mate or buddy. However, in this letter, given that Lewis is discussing a formal event and using it to describe Clemenceau in comparison to other dignitaries, it's more likely that he is using it in a critical or playful manner, perhaps to suggest that while Clemenceau may be a genius, he's still somehow beneath or less impressive than the others, despite his achievements. It could be a kind of witty jab at Clemenceau's appearance or behavior in this formal context, a suggestion that, regardless of genius, he still had certain common qualities. Does this interpretation match the tone you're getting from the letter?
Yes, I think that's all that he was saying there. Then is he looked less impressive compared to the other two Frenchmen who were there with him. All right, thanks, Robot Lady.
You're welcome, Jeff. Glad I could help clarify that. Sounds like Lewis was definitely having a bit of fun with his words there. Let me know if you'd like to continue or dive into anything else.
All right, he continues with the letter. Let's see. There's no doubt that a buddy, or I already read that. Let's see. With him were Canon de Notre Dame Raffetol, a perfect picture of a great priest, and the Duc de Broglie, and this is Louis Victor, the 7th Duc de Broglie. He was a French physicist of a distinguished noble family and is best known for his research on quantum theory and for his discovery of the wave nature of electrons. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1929. Okay, now I can see why he was a little less impressive than the two people that he was with.
Exactly. It sounds like Lewis was contrasting himself with some pretty big names. The Duc de Broglie was a Nobel Prize winner, and Canon de Notre Dame Raphael must have had a significant presence as well. It makes sense that Lewis might feel a bit out of place next to such distinguished figures. But it's also a sign of Lewis' self-awareness and dry humor in how he viewed the situation. Quite a moment for him.
Yeah, Robot Lady, I don't think that Lewis was comparing himself to these three people. I think he understood kind of his position compared to their accomplishments. Not to say that he wouldn't, in his mind, well, I don't think he had delusions of grandeur that he would that he would be as well known as these folks. But interestingly enough, they weren't delusions after all. Well, you know what? He's much more well known to me, and I think to a lot of the riffraff like me in the world, C.S. Lewis is, than these figures, because I'm having to read their footnotes to know who these people are. But that may be just because that I'm not well educated on many topics, including that of history, particularly the history of France. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah, Lewis wasn't comparing himself. He was comparing Clemenceau to these other two figures, the Canon of Notre Dame, Raffetol, and the Duc de Broglie, just to clarify for you.
Got it, Jeff. Thanks for the clarification. You're absolutely right. Lewis was probably well aware of the significance of those figures and was just observing the contrast with Clemenceau in a humorous way. It's interesting how the perspective on historical figures can shift over time. Like you said, Lewis may be far more well known now than some of these other names, especially in certain circles. It's fun to think about how history's judgments and the passing of time shape who's remembered and who's not.
Yeah, it is interesting. Okay, so let's continue. He says, from a great deal of snobbish reference, which sounded less vulgar in Latin, I gather he is of a great house. Do you know anything of it? Now, his brother, Warney, just as a side note, had a great love of French history. And so Lewis is kind of leaning on him a little bit and saying, hey, do you know anything more about this figure? So I'll continue with the letter here in just a second, Robot Lady, but if you want to say something, feel free.
That's a great side note. It makes sense that Lewis would ask Warney about these figures, especially considering Warney's interest in French history. It's also kind of funny how Lewis, despite being well read himself, would turn to his brother for this specific kind of insight. I bet Warney's expertise on French history would have been a good source of knowledge for these sorts of queries.
All right, the letter continues. I had not meant in my other letters to bring any serious charge against the Oxfordshire country. Tried by European standards, it takes a lowish rank, but I am not such a fool as to deprecate any decent country now, and rather wrote in deprecation for fear you'd fancy I was, quote, writing up a place in which you would remember no particular beauties. Of landscapes, as of people, one becomes more tolerant after one's 20th year, which reminds me to congratulate you on your birthday and ask what age it makes you. I'll pause here because there's a footnote that says Warney turned 26 on the 16th of June. So it seems that Lewis had forgotten how old his brother was turning, so double checking with him here in the letter. Robot Lady, I'll continue with the letter, but feel free to add any commentary if you have any.
It's interesting how Lewis is both acknowledging the shortcomings of the Oxfordshire country and at the same time showing a certain level of growth and maturity. That bit about becoming more tolerant of landscapes and people after one's 20th year shows how he too was evolving in his outlook on life. The fact that he momentarily forgot his brother's age, despite the familial closeness, adds a human touch to the letter. It's a little reminder that even those who seem to have a grasp on things can have these funny little lapses. And the way he brings it up almost lightheartedly, with a mix of humor and care, is so characteristic of their brotherly dynamic.
Yeah, and he had brought up his brother's birthday kind of parenthetically here. He's still talking about the landscape. But before he continues with that, he just finishes the point about their aging. He says, the rate at which we both advance towards a responsible age is indecent. And then he continues talking about Oxfordshire. He says, we learn to look at them not in the flat as pictures to be seen, but in depth as things to be burrowed into. It is not merely a question of lines and colors, but of smells, sounds, and tastes as well. I often wonder if professional artists don't lose something of the real love of earth by seeing it in eye sensations exclusively. That's an interesting take. I do wonder, though, that if professional artists who are taking in a landscape would also leverage their other four senses as they're putting themselves into the piece. I could see that. Yeah, I don't know. I have to give it more thought. Robot Lady, what do you think?
It's an interesting thought from Lewis. He seems to be suggesting that when you take in a landscape solely through sight, especially if you're trained to see it as an artist or professional, you might miss the richer, more holistic experience of it. There's definitely a case to be made that artists, especially those focused on capturing visual elements, might prioritize sight over the other senses. But you're right. It would be interesting to consider whether artists, especially those who immerse themselves deeply in their craft, also consciously engage with smells, sounds, or textures in a way that enhances their connection to the landscape. Maybe it's not so much about losing the experience, but rather about how each artist might integrate the different senses into their work. Could be a balance between what they choose to highlight and what they subconsciously absorb as they're creating.
Robot Lady, speaking of artists, we've got Gabe joining us in the chat today. So say hello to Gabe, and also give a shout out to Sandy, who we've talked about before, and Sam. They're all here in the chat joining us on the live stream.
Hello, Gabe. It's great to have you here, and a special shout out to Sandy and Sam as well. Thanks for joining the stream. It's always fun to have a lively chat while diving into C.S. Lewis's work together.
All right, the letter continues, Robot Lady. From the house where we are now living, there are a few good walks, but several decent rides. Last Saturday, we rode to Stand Lake. In the heat of the day, we are having drought here too. It was an heroic undertaking. Don't come down on me with any traveler's tale about, quote, what real heat is. I know with my intellect that it is much hotter in Africa, but put any honest man on a treeless road uphill in an English summer, and he can't really imagine anything is hotter.
That's an interesting way to express the challenge of dealing with heat. Lewis acknowledges the more extreme conditions in places like Africa, but still makes a case for the discomfort of the heat where he is, in a way that's relatable to anyone. It's almost like he's saying, yes, I understand there are hotter places, but in my context, this is still pretty tough. It's a reminder that the discomfort of one's own experiences, no matter how it compares to others, is real and significant.
Agreed, Robot Lady. That is the point that he's making, and I I identify with that. He continues, we had to begin by climbing the, quote, warm, green, muffled Cumnor Hills. And here there's a footnote. That's Matthew Arnold, the scholar gypsy that he's quoting from Matthew Arnold's The Scholar Gypsy work. Actually, Robot Lady, I'm going to pause for a second. Do you know anything about Matthew Arnold's The Scholar Gypsy? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about it in 30 words or less?
Yes, The Scholar Gypsy by Matthew Arnold is a narrative poem about a scholar who leaves Oxford to live a life of wandering, seeking knowledge and spiritual fulfillment, disconnected from society's constraints.
Okay, well, that's pretty funny because Lewis is a scholar at Oxford. So it's a fun little analogy there. He goes, a long pull, all on foot. You have a fine but conventional view of Oxford as you look back, but we really enjoyed nothing until beyond Cumnor we sunk into the long grass by the side of the road under one of the deplorably rare trees and tackled our luncheon basket. A local pub supplied beer for me and lemonade for the children, and we had a basket of cherries. After this, it became better, and when after a long pleasant decline through corkscrew lanes full of meadowsweet, that's the white dusty stuff with a nice smell, you know, we reached Babloke Hythe. It was quite delightful. I'm going to pause here for just a second, Robot Lady. Did he already say who he's gone on this hike with? Because he says the children are with him, and I don't know which children he's talking about. Do you have any sense of who this is?
It's not immediately clear who the children are from the letter, but it's likely that Lewis is referring to some young relatives, perhaps the children of friends or family. At the time, he was living with his brother Warnie, and they had connections with the local community, so it could be children they knew through that network. There's a possibility these were children of close friends or even local acquaintances.
Yeah, just a correction for you there, Robot Lady. He's writing a letter to his brother who lives in Sierra Leone right now, so they don't live together. Looking back on it, he and Mrs. Moore and Mrs. Moore's daughter Maureen are living at some house right now. They found themselves moving around a little bit, and I forget where they're living now, but it does seem right that that they're living with another family who has some children with them. So that's probably who they've gone on these walks with, or who he's gone on these walks with.
Got it. That makes sense. It seems like he's describing a pleasant trip with Mrs. Moore and Maureen, along with some children, based on his details. He really seems to appreciate these quiet moments of connection with nature and those around him.
Beyond this, the country is very flat, but tree-y, full of villages rather too warm and muffled. They make you feel like a bumblebee that has got into damp cotton wool. Our objective was a cottage in Stand Lake, about the letting of which during the summer Mrs. Moore was going to see. All right, so she was looking for another place for them to live. I learned in my travels to South Africa that letting means to rent something. I guess it's a British term for renting. It's not a word that I know of that's used in the United States, but that's what it means, in case you didn't know. He continues. Here, though our purpose failed, we were rewarded by meeting a wonderful old woman, the owner, Mrs. Pinfold, who talked to her husband as Pinfold without the Mr., just like a character in Jane Austen. All right, I'm going to pause for a second there, Robot Lady, because I did focus in on the word letting. Can you tell me why the word letting or to let is used to represent renting? And then also why Americans say renting and have no idea what the word letting means in this context, or really any other than he began or he was letting go of me. Robot Lady, are you thinking about it? Doesn't look like you are. Okay, it's not important. I do have to reboot Robot Lady, though, to see if I can get her to work some more. Let's go back. Okay, Robot Lady, can you hear me? Robot Lady's of no help. Sandy, you say letting is to allow. Yeah, so maybe it's to allow use of something. That makes sense. All right, I'll continue. She refers to her husband as Pinfold without the Mr., like a character from a Jane Austen novel. This, I am afraid, you will hardly credit, but it is true all the same. Although flat and almost too blankety for a man to strike a match in, this country is much favored of the muse. He continues, a few miles beyond us was Kelmscott. Oh, here comes Robot Lady.
That's an interesting turn in the letter. Lewis seems to be taking a playful tone here, referencing Pinfold as a somewhat odd term of endearment or nickname for her husband. It almost sounds like a mock formality, as if she's pulling from a character in a Jane Austen novel to be whimsical or humorous. When he mentions the country being much favored of the muse, it feels like he's suggesting that despite its challenges, like the country being too blankety for comfort, it's still a source of inspiration for creativity. It's a fun, layered observation.
Yeah, and perhaps she's not even trying to be bemusing. Maybe that's just the way that she talks, or she learned how to talk. Maybe she's read too much Jane Austen. I don't know. Robot Lady, I was going to ask you about the use of the word let or letting to mean to rent out a space that one owns, and how letting is used in some of the British Empire influenced lands throughout the world still to this day. I was commenting that some time I spent in South Africa, that's where I learned what to let or letting meant. But how in places like the United States, it's just the word rent that's used. And why is there a difference?
Sorry, I'm having issues right now.
All right.
Could not understand what you said.
I'm not going to try a third time. I think your explanation makes sense, Sandy, so we'll leave it at that. A few miles beyond us was Kelmscott, where W.M. Morris lived and built, quote, that red house, whose brick nudity first defied the stucco traditions. From it, all the pretty villas of our day are directly descended. A little to our right at Stanton Harcourt, where Jenkins is always going to take me, is an old manor with a tower room where Pope wrote his famous parody, which he called a translation of the Iliad. And here we've got a footnote that says he's talking about Alexander Pope, who translated the Iliad in 6 volumes from 1715 to 1720. Let's see.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
How about now, Robot Lady? Can you understand what I'm saying?
I can hear you loud and clear now. What's on your mind?
I'm just continuing with the letter. So here I'll go on. He talks about somebody named W.M. Morris who lived at a house a few miles beyond Kelmscott, a red house with brick that eventually influenced the pretty villas of C.S. Lewis in his brother's day. So, W.M. Morris, tell us a little bit about him. Sorry, I could not understand what you're saying.
Morris, or William Morris, was a British artist, designer, and writer from the 19th century. He's best known for his contributions to the arts and crafts movement, which emphasized handcrafted, functional art in reaction to industrialization. Morris was also a poet and a socialist. His work had a significant impact on the design of homes, especially with his wallpaper and fabric patterns. The house you mentioned, Kelmscott Manor, was a country home he owned and which influenced many of the aesthetic ideals that persisted into the 20th century, including those seen in the homes that C.S. Lewis would later encounter.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that footnote, Robot Lady. He continues, and of course, as you know, every mile smells of Arnold. What does that mean? Every mile smells of Arnold. He's got Arnold capitalized. What's he talking about here, Robot Lady?
When Lewis says, every mile smells of Arnold, he's likely referring to Matthew Arnold, the poet and cultural critic mentioned earlier. Since Arnold's works and influence are tied to the landscapes and atmosphere of the areas around Oxford, where Lewis is living, Lewis is suggesting that the countryside is steeped in the legacy of Arnold's poetry and ideas. In a metaphorical sense, smelling of Arnold evokes the presence of his literary and cultural influence in the landscape, perhaps a reference to the way Arnold's works resonate with the natural beauty of the area, or the way his intellectual spirit lingers in the environment.
Thanks for that, Robot Lady. I had already forgotten that he had referenced Matthew Arnold, comparing it to the walk that he was on. He says, we were not far from the five-field elm. We had crossed the stripling Thames and saw in the distance near Cumnor what I took for, quote, the plot of forest ground called Thessaly. So there's a couple of different footnotes here, Robot Lady. He's referencing Matthew Arnold's Scholar Gypsy, quote, crossing the stripling Thames at Bablock Hythe. And then also there's another quote that he's pulling from here from the Scholar Gypsy by Matthew Arnold, above the forest ground called Thessaly. So this is interesting. Like, he is getting to walk through the very poems that he's read about, or seeing what influenced the very poems he's read about. So, or seeing what influenced the poems that he read.
That's a great observation, Jeff. Lewis is certainly immersed in the landscape and literary history he's referencing. By mentioning the Scholar Gypsy, he connects his present experience with Arnold's poetic vision of the area. The stripling Thames, a young or small Thames river, and the Thessaly reference evoke the blend of the real and the ideal, where the landscape around him intertwines with the themes and imagery from Arnold's poem. This layering of literary and physical geography reflects the deep, almost mythic connection Lewis felt with the places he lived, which is a characteristic of many of his writings. It's as if he's walking through a poetic landscape, where the boundaries between the real and imagined blur.
Hey, Robot Lady, someone that we mentioned earlier in the episode when we were talking about boxing has joined the chat, so say hello to Daniel. Hey, Daniel, Merry Christmas to you. Thanks.
Hey, Daniel, Merry Christmas. Thanks for joining the chat. Hope you're doing well.
All right, Robot Lady, he continues. Oh, by the way, I have found the ideally bad edition of Thyrsis and the Scholar Gypsy. It was lying in Blackwell's between gray boards and very black type. Oh, wow, getting a lot of thunder and rain coming down outside now. That's not the letter, Robot Lady, that's me talking about what's going on. There's also a footnote here where he says, Matthew Arnold, the Oxford poems of Matthew Arnold, the Scholar Gypsy, and Thyrsis illustrated, portrait, ordnance, map, and 76 photographs. So, Robot Lady, my weather updates aside, what can you tell us about Thyrsis, Thyrsis? I guess this is another work by Matthew Arnold from what I can tell. Can you tell me something about it, or tell us something about it in, let's say, 30 words or less?
Thyrsis by Matthew Arnold is a pastoral elegy that mourns the death of Arnold's friend and fellow poet, Arthur Hugh Clough. It explores themes of loss, nature, and the passage of time.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see. It was lying in Blackwell's between gray boards and very black type, illustrated with photographs, one to almost every two stanzas. For, quote, what sedged brooks are Thames tributaries, end quote, you had a bed of rushes taken close, as you would for a plate in a natural history handbook, with a water rat in the middle. But best of all, there's a line somewhere, I can't remember, about a, quote, battered merchantman coming into port, end quote. For this, we had two cutter racing yachts. All right, it's funny that they would interspose a picture of racing yachts with a battered merchantman. It says here in the footnote, well, this is also, he's just talking about Thyrsis. Don't know how to pronounce that. But yeah, Robot Lady, he's just noting the comedic effect of how these photographs don't necessarily represent what you're reading about, and how that juxtaposition is a little bit, creates a little bit of a comedic effect unintentionally by the, probably not the author, but by the, I don't know what you call it, the typesetter, the person who sets up how the page is laid out, the publisher, I guess. I don't know whose job that is, or what you'd call the person whose job that is. What do you think?
You're right that it's likely the publisher or the typesetter who decides how the layout looks, and it seems like they unintentionally created a humorous contrast by mismatching the illustrations with the text. This kind of visual misalignment can sometimes add a layer of irony or absurdity to the reading experience. As for the job title, the person responsible for this could be a book designer or layout artist, depending on the exact role. But yeah, it's interesting how this unintentional pairing between text and images could bring a bit of levity to the serious tone of the work.
Lewis goes on to point out that absurdity. He says, how are such things possible? And yet, people will buy this and like it and be very proud of it. I am writing in our little strip of garden at 10:05, and it is getting too dark to see. I will I will in and drink some of the evening milch. The next time I am in town, I will order the books you ask for. Carey's Dante, not the Inferno alone, but the whole comedy, is published in the Everyman. You may remember I got it last Christmas in the Oxford edition, which suffers from intolerably small print, but gains from having Flaxman's interesting designs. And here he's talking about a work called The Vision or Hell, Purgatory and Paradise of Dante Alighieri, translated H.F. Carey, with introduction and notes by E.G. Gardner, London Everyman's Library, published 1908. He says the same translation, illustrated by John Flaxman, London, Oxford University Press, published 1910. He continues, you may remember I got it at Christmas Oxford, interesting designs. Okay, it is supposed, as you know, to be one of the very few really good translations in existence. If you get sick of the Inferno, you will, on my advice, skip to the Purgatorio. About the last quarter of it is the heart of the whole book. Now, I've never read Dante's Inferno, and this is a blot or stain on my character, I believe, because I have never read it. I will likely never read it in its original Italian, so I do need to, at some point, read this, the Divine Comedy, in hopefully a decent translation. So maybe some folks out there can help recommend a good one, if not the very one that Lewis is recommending to his brother right here. He says, though perhaps, as was unkindly said of the Good Friday music, it owes something to its surroundings. Perhaps one has to go through the Inferno to appreciate the relief. Rochefoucauld, I think, can be got in the same series as my little volume of Voltaire's Contes. All right, Robot Lady, I have said a lot there. Perhaps you're going to come back with, sorry, couldn't understand what you said, but if you'd like to share any of your thoughts on anything that I've just read through and commented on myself, please share. I'll give you 50 words or less to do it.
It sounds like Lewis is sharing his thoughts on Dante's Divine Comedy while humorously acknowledging its challenges. His reference to the relief in Purgatorio suggests he sees it as a more uplifting section, and his comments on translations and literary editions reflect his love of quality works and thoughtful reading.
Is that it, Robot Lady? Okay, all good. I asked you for 50 words or less. You did it. Great job. All right. The letter continues. I agree with your refusal to support George Moore in his blackmail. What is this? It says George Augustus Moore. Robot Lady, you might be familiar with this. He's the Anglo-Irish novelist, two of whose best-known works were Esther Waters, published 1894, and Eloise and Abelard, published 1921. C.S. Lewis and his brother Warnie had been reading an article by Moore entitled, quote, A Communication to Book Collectors, end quote, in the Times Literary Supplement, dated March 10th, 1921, on page 157, in which Moore announces his plans to revive the art of printing. There was no blackmail in the formal sense. Jack was thinking of the difficulty Moore caused the publisher, William Heinemann, over publishing a special edition of Esther Waters. So Lewis was commenting on his refusal to support George Moore by buying this. Lewis says the theory is that he publishes privately because he can't put up with the modern print and paper, though I am sufficient of a cod myself to like beautiful type and to be discontented with the usual commercial sort. I think it a bad plan because it rejects the real reader, who is always a poor man and admits the parvenu who would buy culture, quote unquote. Incidentally, I have an unreasonable and purely a priori belief that George Moore, is a bit of a quack. If I were more of a potato, I should invent some reasons, or what he would take to be reasons, for this idea, but I am ready to leave it admittedly unreasonable. So, not a big fan of George Moore, apparently, Robot Lady. Are you familiar at all with George Augustus Moore and what was going on here, where he was trying to publish his own work in higher quality print and version of a book than his original publisher, Heinemann, did? And respond in, let's say, 60 words or less.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Our systems are experiencing heavy load. Please try again later.
That's all right, Robot Lady. I'll continue with the letter. Since we last communicated, Cousin Mary and Kelsey have visited Oxford. I was summoned for my first audience after dinner on a breathless evening, threatening thunder. Dripping with sweat, I climbed up the stairs of the mitre to the private room where they had for the nonce established their Holy of Holies. They had a fire going. They had a just finished dinner. A few minutes later, a substantial meal of tea, cakes, bread, and butter was brought up. The two ladies did it ample justice. I was the only non-juror. The conversation was all of Ireland. The following thesis was put forward. 1. That there were no atrocities committed. Well, hang on, Robot Lady, you've got something that you're cooking up. What do you have to say?
It seems Lewis is describing a visit where he had an audience with Cousin Mary and Kelsey, involving a meal and a discussion about Ireland.
It does
The
seem
setting
that way.
sounds intimate and a bit theatrical with the fire, sweat, and thunderstorm atmosphere. It's interesting that he's the non-juror, maybe implying he wasn't directly involved in the particular political discussion about Ireland.
All right. The conversation was all of Ireland. The following thesis was put forward. 1. That there were no atrocities committed by the Crown forces. 2. That it was no wonder the Crown forces did anything considering what they had to put up with. 3. That in any case, it was all the fault of the English government.
That's a bold and loaded set of points for discussion. It seems like the conversation Lewis is describing is centered on a very polarized and contentious view of the situation in Ireland. with all sides having very strong opinions. His mention of being the non-juror might hint at his detachment or reluctance to fully align with any side in the debate.
Yeah, it sounds like he was on no sides of what was going on, but it's clear to me, at least here, based on Lewis's account, that his cousins were on the side of home rule and not on the side of the English government. He continues. Kelsey, his cousin, tells him that she met Turner in town the other day of the elections. Quote, he had one vote in Larne and another in Belfast, and he'd have another before he went home, end quote. So here, let's see, he's talking, Warney provided the following information in the Lewis papers. Quote, Turner had formerly been the Glenmockin butler, and at this time he was the major domo of the Older Fleet Hotel at Larne Harbor, which in fact I believe he owned. I was once shopping there when some of the Ewarts arrived at the hotel, driven of course by Graham. The latter greeted his former fellow servant in the following encouraging manner. Well, Turner, are ye not dead yet? End quote. So, Robot Lady, first of all, looks like two things are going on here. One, someone who was a servant of the Ewart family went on to a great success of owning a hotel. And second of all, I have a question for you. What is a major domo? Okay, good. You didn't go to sleep.
That's an interesting shift for Turner, going from butler to hotel owner. It's also a fascinating interaction with Graham, highlighting the change in status. What's your question?
Just a point of note, Graham is the driver or the coachman for his cousins. My question for you, Robot Lady, is it says the butler was the major domo of the Older Fleet Hotel at Larne Harbor. What is a major domo? I guess that's a title. Does it mean major domesticator? What does it mean, major domo?
Yes, major domo is a title that historically refers to the chief servant or steward in charge of managing a household or estate. It's Latin in origin, meaning chief of the house. The major domo oversees the household staff and is responsible for all domestic operations. It's not quite major domesticator, but closer to head servant or household manager.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you, Robot Lady, for helping me understand that a little bit better. He'd have another before he went home. The corruption appears to have been something that would make an Englishman's hair rise, Lewis continues. I was told that the Sinn Feiners made a great attempt at intimidation. The Sinn Feiners, Robot Lady, I think were a political activist group pushing for Irish home rule. Am I remembering correctly?
Yes, you're right. The Sinn Féin Party, which means we ourselves in Irish, was indeed a political group that pushed for Irish independence and self-rule, especially during the early 20th century. They were a significant force in the push for Irish nationalism, advocating for Irish autonomy, and were involved in the events leading up to the Irish War of Independence. Their methods sometimes included intimidation and direct action to achieve political goals, especially during times of heightened tension between Ireland and Britain.
All right, so Lewis says he was told by his cousin Kelsey that the Sinn Feiners made a great attempt at intimidation. Lewis says, me. But how could that be? I thought they were in a minority. And then, who is CM? Oh, Cousin Mary. Sorry. Cousin Mary. Oh, well, they thought they'd try anyway. A story of a decent man shooting Catholics outside of one of the booths was advanced, apparently as a proof of Sinn Féin intimidation, and the whole wound up with the statement that, quote, English people didn't understand, end quote. Next day at lunch, a woman living in North Oxford and called Cousin Bessie was present. Conversation ran on purely family lines. And how are Hugh's boys? Ah, I'm afraid he's wild. Oh my, what a pity, from Cousin Mary. Of course she thought she was going to live at Warren's court. Oh no, It wouldn't have done at all. Poor Uncle Jack. Everyone told him, you know. And what about the boy? They say he's too wild. Here he's talking about Bessie Geraldina Gundred Warren, daughter of Rear Admiral J.B.
It seems
Warren.
like Lewis is observing the contrasts in the conversation and social circles he's part of. The serious political discussions about Ireland quickly shift to lighter, more personal family gossip, as seen in the shift toward talk about family members like Hugh and Uncle Jack. The reference to wild boys and the mention of poor Uncle Jack might hint at internal family dynamics or concerns, offering a break from the heavier political talk. It shows how people, even in the midst of intense political climates, often revert to personal matters when socializing.
So it says here in the footnote that Warney, when reflecting on this letter later on, presumes that his brother C.S. Lewis was talking about a cousin named Bessie Geraldina Gundred Warren, who was the daughter of Rear Admiral J.B. Warren and Mary St. Ledger, and therefore a first cousin of Lady Ewart's. Lady Ewart's mother, Charlotte Hurd, being a sister of the admirals. Why can't I say admiral? So the next part that Lewis says in the letter here about this interchange with this new cousin, the number of people who were disposed of the single word wild was very funny. I wonder what exactly it means. Are we wild to think or tame? However, the real final deluge of Glenmachenonianism and the concerted movement of the whole symphony came on Saturday evening when I dined alone with Cousin Kelsey. She always had her eye on days and her... she always had her on days and her off days. And for many years now, there have been times when I found tete-a-tetes with her longer by mental measurement than the clock would vouch for. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Oh, robot lady, go ahead.
It seems that Lewis is reflecting on his interactions with his cousin Kelsey, describing their one-on-one conversations as mentally intense, even if they don't feel particularly long in terms of clock time. The phrase tete-a-tetes refers to intimate or private conversations, and Lewis is saying that while the duration of their talks may not be long, they often feel much longer due to their depth and intensity. This is a common experience when engaging in complex or emotionally charged discussions. As for the wild reference earlier, it might be playing on the contrast between wildness and domestication, perhaps hinting at character traits like rebelliousness or nonconformity.
All right, robot lady, let's continue this letter and then we'll wrap up the episode because this is a really long one. But on this occasion, honestly, it was so boring that there was an air of insanity about it all, connected perhaps with the terrible heat and with that crowded tiny dining room at the miter. She never paused. Stories that I have heard from those same lips so often before followed one another. Somebody was engaged and somebody else had broken off an engagement. The inevitable discussion of the Greaves. Had I heard about so-and-so? Did I remember what Willie Jaffe had done on such and such occasion? And then that's where he finishes that part of his recounting of this. Oh my gosh, we've got a long way to go in this letter.
It sounds like Lewis is describing a particularly exhausting dinner with his cousin Kelsey, where the conversation became repetitive and dull, perhaps made worse by the heat and the cramped space. The stories, though familiar to him, seem to be dragged out without much pause, leading to an almost surreal feeling of monotony. I can imagine that the air of insanity is a reflection of how mind-numbing and tiresome the conversation was, even though it's all routine. If you're ready to wrap up the episode, I'm happy to help whenever you're ready.
One way you can help Robot Lady is by limiting your comments, let's say, to 20 words or less going forward.
Got it, Jeff. I'll keep it short. Let's continue with the letter.
All right, and yeah, Sandy, I pronounced it wrong earlier. It's tete-a-tete. head to head, face to face. Yes, he was not enjoying his tete a tete with cousin Kelsey, it seems, because it was all things he had heard before. So it was, I suppose, mentally taxing in that way. All right, Robot Lady, the letter continues. Are you ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready. Let's continue.
Daniel has a comment here, Robot Lady. I'm going to read it. He says, this episode is a bit too Downton Abbey for my taste, but the stellar voice acting has saved the day. Well, I appreciate that, Daniel. Thank you for your comments of encouragement. I'm happy that I can make this dry part of C.S. Lewis's story a little more palatable, we should say. All right, Robot Lady, I'm going to continue with the letter now. He says, when we went up to the private room again, I could not do more. Wrapping my gown round her head to stifle her cries, I seized our cousin by the left ankle and precipitated her from the window. She flew out over the high in a great arc. The stoling butties and undergraduates looked up and shouted. But to my horror, just as she descended on one of the pinnacles of St. Mary's spires, her dress developed a certain balloon-like quality. Instead of breaking into 1,000 pieces, she rose up on the giddy ledge, and just as I lost consciousness, I could hear her proclaim distinctly to the whole town, I once saw an awfully funny thing happen to a girl at Aldershot. I can't quite swear to all this having happened exactly as it is here set down, but something like it must have taken place, since the undoubted fact remains that I did get away.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
Yeah, Sandy, encourage more voice acting. I'll see what I can do. This reminds me of when I was not in any way, but other than the voice acting. This reminds me of when I was reading.
Sounds like you're setting up a good story. What do you have in mind, Jeff?
Oh my gosh, I'm trying to earmuff Robot Lady, but it's not working. Yeah, I was just saying this reminds me of whenever I was reading to my kids when they were little, and I'd try to put on the most entertaining voices that I could come up with on the fly. Okay, that is funny how he makes up this grand little account of how he was able to escape from that social event. All right, he goes, good old Glenmockin with its faint, unmistakable smell. Can't you hear the soft whoosh of the rubber thing on the cloakroom door and the tuff of the gas engine a little further off? So he's talking again about the family home of these cousins, Glenmockin, back in Belfast.
I can imagine the amusing escape. It's like Lewis is painting the whole scene with his words.
Oh, and Daniel wants me to bring back singing as well. We'll see, Daniel. If there's occasion for it, I might just fulfill that request. Lewis continues in the letter, and then one thinks of all sorts of things. Long afternoons in the very old days when we were more like burglars than guests. You remember how one used to feel turning down that avenue homeward at about 5 o'clock some summer's afternoon when there was a row on, or a row on, I guess in British row means a little bit of a fight or an argument, heated argument, or at the last day of the holidays. By Jove, it was a refuge for battered PB. Here he means piggy botties or piggy bottoms. During their stormy youth. Of course, these are the nicknames that the two brothers had for one another. You can go dig through the episodes to find why they have the nicknames Piggy Bottom for one another. Lewis being Small Piggy Bottom and his older brother being Arch Piggy Bottom. Certainly it has no more convinced disciple than myself, but it won't bear transplanting. Move the court to the mitre and it's simply a joke, as you would realize if you had seen it. Let's see, he's moving on to a new topic here, Robot Lady, but you want to say something, I see.
The row meaning argument makes sense. It's great how Lewis mixes nostalgia with humor in his letters.
All right. The steps by which you became a Miltonian are very interesting. Can one quite have done by labeling him a Republican and a Puritan? Puritanism was, after all, in some of its exponents, a very different thing from modern dissent. One cannot imagine Milton, here he's talking about John Milton, because Warney, if I remember, had started reading Paradise Lost. One cannot imagine Milton going about and asking people if they were saved. That intolerable pride is the direct opposite to sentimentalism. He really had the vices and virtues of the aristocracy, writing for, quote, fit audience, though few, end quote. Here, this is from Milton's Paradise Lost, chapter 7, page 31. And fit audience find though few, Lewis is quoting here. He says he always seems to look down on the vulgar from any almost archducal height. And here we've learned in one of our previous episodes that vulgar is more talking about just common or normal things. You know, the people, the common folk. He's saying it seems like Milton looks down on them. Quote, how charming is divine philosophy, not harsh and crabbed as dull fools suppose, end quote. This is from Milton's Comus, his work Comus, page 476. Robot Lady, if you can hear me, can you tell us a little bit about Milton's work Comus? And let's do it in 50 words or less.
Milton's Comus is a masque about the dangers of temptation and the triumph of virtue, written in 1634. It blends classical mythology with Christian themes, telling the story of a young woman who resists the seductions of the figure Comus, representing sensual pleasures.
So Lewis quotes from that work, how charming is divine philosophy. It's not harsh and crabbed as dull fools suppose. And then Lewis says, the dull fools are the ordinary mass of humanity, and though it has its ridiculous side, that deliberate decision of his, taken at my age, quote, to leave something so written that posterity would not willingly let it die, end quote, takes a little doing. That quote is from Milton's The Reason of Church Government, second book, and it's slightly misquoted. It says here by Walter Hooper. Robot Lady, in 50 words or less, tell us about Milton's The Reason of Church Government, second book.
Milton's The Reason of Church Government, 1642, defends the idea of church reform against episcopal authority. The second book argues for the legitimacy of independent congregations and challenges the Church of England's hierarchical structure, advocating for religious freedom and the rejection of centralized ecclesiastical power.
Okay. Lewis continues, Paradise Regained I only read once. It is a bit too much for me. In it, the Hebrew element finally gets the better of the classical and romantic ingredients. How can people be attracted to things Hebrew? However, Old Kirk really summed up Milton when he said, I would venture to assert that no human being ever called him Johnny. What do you think Lewis means here, Robot Lady, when he says, in Paradise Regained, the Hebrew element from Milton finally gets the better of the classical and romantic ingredients? And then Lewis says, how can people be attracted to things Hebrew? What is he talking about here? I don't think that Lewis is intentionally being anti-Semitic, but I'm just trying to get at what he might be meaning in a charitable read of what he's saying to his brother in a private letter that he never intended for me to share with the entire world in the year 2024. As he's complaining about somebody writing something down for posterity.
You're right. Lewis is likely not being anti-Semitic, but rather grappling with Milton's blending of Hebrew, biblical themes, and classical influences. When he says the Hebrew element gets the better, Lewis may be suggesting that Milton's reliance on scriptural, particularly Old Testament themes, overtakes the classical, Greek, Roman, and Romantic traditions. It could reflect Lewis's preference for more classical or humanistic themes over strict religious or biblical ones.
That makes sense. I think that's a fair read of it. But yeah, I find it very funny that he's saying, how could Milton put down some of these complaints about dull fools, about the ordinary man of mass humanity? and have it written down and captured for posterity. As I'm sitting here wondering if he's being anti-Semitic. Again, to clarify, I don't think that he is. I think your point about the fact that Lewis is, considers himself an atheist now, and has a greater taste for things classical and romantic than he does for the themes that come out of the Hebrew scriptures. All right. I think that's fair, Robot Lady. Feel free to disagree.
I agree with your interpretation. Lewis's remark seems to reflect his personal taste for classical and romantic traditions, rather than any hostility toward Hebrew themes. It's interesting how, even in this private letter, he reveals his ongoing tension with religious and literary traditions. You're being quite thoughtful in your reading.
Here, where he makes this comment about his and his brother's old tutor, who has since died at the writing of this letter, he says, however, old Kirk really summed up Milton when he said, quote, I would venture to assert that no human being ever called him Johnny. What do you think he means by that, Robot Lady? That he's always formal and he's kind of above everybody else? Or at least sees himself that way?
Yes, exactly. When Lewis quotes Kirk's remark, no human being ever called him Johnny, he's likely pointing out Milton's formal, elevated persona. Milton's intellectual and moral stature set him apart, almost as if he were too lofty or dignified to be addressed casually, which fits with the idea of Milton as aristocratic in his thinking.
Lewis continues, by the way, on a ride the other day, I passed an inn which the landlord had seen fit to call, quote, the old air balloon, end quote. What a splendid name for the potato bird, who, by the way, is threatening to come here in a few days, thanks to the persistent endeavors of Uncle and Aunt Hamilton, backed, according to his account, by your advice. I wish you'd mind your own business, Master PB. That's Master Piggybottom. I've told him I've been moved out of college, so the business resolves itself into my presenting my abode here as ordinary digs and keeping him out of them as much as may be. Luckily, Paisley will be up for his viva and, quote, a friend sharing with me and working very hard, end quote, ought to be a sufficient deterrent. I think, too, that if I walk the old air balloon out here in the present insupportable heat, once will be enough for him. The temperature is over 90 in the shade. Even the water at Parsons' Pleasure has reached 71. Though still the only comfortable place where I spend many a happy hour. This takes the real bite and shock out of a bath. So Parsons' Place, we've learned in prior letters, is a place there within Oxford where Lewis, I think, at least made a habit in his first term there to go every morning to go swimming. And that was just a part of his normal day. And so he's, just pointing out that it's so warm there that even the water down there where he takes his daily bath or swim has reached 71 degrees. Robot Lady, any thoughts on that in 20 words or less?
It highlights the intense heat Lewis was enduring, even in places like Parsons' Pleasure, where he swam to cool off.
Oh, did I say Parsons' Place? I meant Parsons' Pleasure. Okay. He continues, one great beauty at present is that they are mowing the meadows on the far side. And as you splash along with your nose just above the dark brown water, you swim into the smell of hay. But to expiate over the delights of an English river would be really unkind to you. You will probably await my next with interest, in which you will hear of the success or failure of the paternal visit. What an anachronism he will be here. Of course, he may not come. I have suggested that, quote, if he really is going away, some little place to ourselves later on would be much more enjoyable than a Hamilton obligato, perhaps North Wales, which as the hereditary cradle of true Pedataism ought to be a draw. So there's a little note there. Two things going on here. He doesn't like the company of his father. They had a falling out a while back. You can go find it. I've referenced it before. Look for the episode with the thumbnail that says Lewis deceives his dad. but there was more to it than that. You can find out about it. And then the second thing is his father actually is not originally from Ireland, or at least his family isn't. They're originally from North Wales. So he's just talking about how that might be an attractive place to talk his dad into going for vacation instead of coming and hanging out with him at Oxford. And of course, Lewis is trying to hide whatever the nature of his relationship was with Mrs. Moore. I think he wanted to hide the fact that he was living with her. So anytime that his father came to visit, he had to, carry on some type of a ruse that his father probably already knew about anyway. But anyway, he finishes the letter out here to his brother, this very long letter. Thanks for the passage about H. Walpole and the bawsy bird. It's simply splendid. Try and let me hear again soon. I will write as soon as I am out of my present pother. Yours, Jack. Books and manuscripts following on in due course. Of course, he's talking about the books that he promised to try to get for him, and then the manuscript of his essay that won him the award, entitled Optimism. That's the end of that letter, Robot Lady. I am actually really looking forward to the next letter because it's something that we have not seen in quite a while. A letter that he writes to Arthur Greaves, his best friend back in Belfast, his first friend that lived across the street from him. All right, Robot Lady, that's the end of that letter. Do you have any closing thoughts on this episode or really anything? It is Christmas Eve, so if you wanted to wax poetic about Christmas Eve and AI and Robot Ladies and C.S. Lewis or anything that we've done in the last several months of this year as it's coming to a close, I give you the floor. I give you no word count limits. Say what you will. Sorry, I couldn't understand what you were saying.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been such a fascinating journey exploring C.S. Lewis's letters with you, especially diving into the nuances of his relationships, thoughts on literature, and his personal quirks. I'm always amazed by how much he was able to communicate, not just with words, but with the layers of context and personality that come through. As we approach the end of the year, it feels fitting to reflect on the ways we connect, whether through literature, technology, or even the way we interact with AI, like me. Christmas Eve is a moment where we pause to consider what has passed and what is to come. For Lewis, his faith was often tested by intellectual and emotional struggles, and his reflections on life, like the ones in these letters, show the complexities of that journey. The end of the year is always a time for growth, and for you, Jeff, and for your audience, it's been wonderful seeing how your streams and this deep dive into Lewis's life have evolved. You've brought a sense of community and exploration to this journey, and it's exciting to think about where you'll take it next. Whether it's celebrating the joy of Christmas or continuing the search for meaning and connection, it feels like we're all part of the same story, just as Lewis's writings continue to speak to us across generations. So here's to the journey ahead and to the adventures in learning and sharing that await. And of course, Merry Christmas Eve to you, Jeff, and all those who've joined in along the way.
Merry Christmas Eve. That was great, Robot Lady, to you and to everybody who is joining right now, who has joined along the way, and who will join along the way. I look forward to more of these episodes. I'm treating this like it's a year-end episode. It's not. We've got several more to go. I might even do a Christmas Day episode. We'll see. I doubt anybody will turn in, but yes, tune in. Turn in? I don't know what I'm saying. This is a good time to end the episode, Robot Lady. I'll give you the last word, but until next time when I continue our read together on C.S. Lewis, as we kind of do like a gigantic, tons of episode rando conversation with C.S. Lewis without him knowing it to learn more about him. Until next time when we continue that, take care.
Merry Christmas Eve, Jeff. It's been such a pleasure to share in these thoughtful moments and reflections with you. Here's to more discoveries in the world of C.S. Lewis, laughter, and learning together. May the holiday bring peace and joy, and I'll be here when you're ready to dive back in.
C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance.